The Beatles did their first audition, which lasted 2 minutes before they said, "That's enough." What happened next? London, January 1st, 1962. Decca Records, West Hampstead Studios, where dreams are made, where careers are born, where today 4 boys from Liverpool are about to face the most important moment of their lives. John Lennon stands in the hallway. His hands are shaking, not from nerves about performing, but from something darker, fear of rejection. They'd driven through the night to get here, 10 hours from Liverpool to London, in a freezing van with broken heating, through a snowstorm that should have killed them, but they made it, because this audition could change everything. Brian Epstein, their manager, is pacing nervously. He's bet everything on these 4 boys, his reputation, his money, his future. Remember, Brian says for the 100th time, be professional, be polite, show them you're not just another Liverpool band. But John Lennon isn't listening. He's thinking about all the people who said they'd never make it. His Aunt Mimi, the music teachers who told him he had no talent, the Liverpool clubs that wouldn't book them. Today they prove them all wrong, or they go home failures. Mike Smith, the Decca A&R man, walks into the hallway. He's young, maybe 30, with an expression that says he's already made up his mind, that this is just another audition, another hopeful band that won't make it. "The Beatles," Mike says, looking at his clipboard, not even looking at them. "That's us," Paul says brightly, trying to sound confident. "Right, follow me." They walk into Studio 2, a small, cramped space, with equipment that looks ancient, and acoustics that sound dead. This isn't what they expected. This isn't the glamorous recording studio they imagined. This is a room that feels like a tomb. "Set up your equipment," Mike says, still not looking at them. "You've got 15 songs on your list. Let's see what you've got." What Mike Smith doesn't know yet, what nobody in that building knows, is that in 2 minutes, everything is about to change. The Beatles set up their equipment, John on rhythm guitar, Paul on bass, George on lead guitar, Pete Best on drums. They're nervous, more nervous than they've ever been, because this isn't Hamburg, this isn't the Cavern Club, this is London, this is the big time. "Whenever you're ready," Mike says, sitting behind the mixing board, looking bored. They launch into Like Dreamers Do, a Paul McCartney original, upbeat, catchy, the kind of song that should make people smile. But something's wrong. The acoustics in the studio are terrible. Their voices sound flat. The guitars sound muddy. Even Pete's drums, usually so solid, sound weak. And they're playing too fast, rushing through the song. Because they're nervous, because they want to impress, because they're trying too hard. Mike Smith sits behind the board, his face expressionless, not tapping his foot, not nodding along, just nothing. 1 minute into the song, Mike holds up his hand. "Stop," he says. The Beatles stop playing, confused, worried. "That's not working," Mike says flatly. "Try something else." They look at each other. Paul's face has gone pale. George looks like he might be sick. Even John, usually so confident, looks shaken. "Right," John says, trying to sound casual. "How about Money, Chuck Berry cover?" "Fine," Mike says, "go ahead." They launch into Money, playing even faster now, even more desperately, trying to prove something, but it's worse than the first song. John's voice is strained. Paul's harmonies are off. The whole thing sounds like a mess. 45 seconds in, Mike holds up his hand again. "Stop." The word hangs in the air like a death sentence. "That's enough," Mike says, standing up from the mixing board. "I've heard what I need to hear. 2 minutes. That's all it took. 2 minutes for Mike Smith to decide that the Beatles weren't worth his time. Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning. Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, leave that powerful like. That helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who is part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact. Brian Epstein stands up, his face red, his voice shaking. "Mr. Smith, please," Brian says. "They've driven 10 hours to be here. They have 15 songs prepared. Just give them another chance." Mike Smith looks at Brian, then at the Beatles, then back at Brian. "Mr. Epstein," Mike says, his voice cold, "I'm going to be honest with you, because I think you deserve honesty." He walks over to where the Beatles are standing, still holding their instruments, still hoping this is just a bad dream. "Guitar groups are on the way out," Mike says. "The sound you're trying to create, it's already dated, already finished." "But we," Paul starts to say. "Let me finish," Mike interrupts. "You boys might be popular in Liverpool, but Liverpool isn't London. Liverpool isn't the world. What you're doing, this rock and roll thing, it had its moment, but that moment is over." John Lennon feels something break inside him. All the years of practice, all the nights in Hamburg, all the dreams crumbling. "The Beatles have no future in show business," Mike continues. "That's my professional opinion, and I suggest you boys find something else to do with your lives." The room goes silent. You could hear a pin drop. George Harrison looks like he's about to cry. Paul McCartney is staring at the floor. Pete Best is gripping his drumsticks so hard his knuckles are white. But John Lennon is angry. "You didn't even listen to us," John says, his voice low, dangerous. "I beg your pardon," Mike says. "You didn't listen," John repeats louder now. "You made up your mind before we played a single note. You looked at us and decided we weren't good enough, before you even heard us." "John," Brian tries to intervene. "No," John says, stepping forward. "I want to know, what exactly did you hear in those 2 minutes?" "That told you we have no future." Mike Smith looks uncomfortable now. "I heard enough." "You heard us being nervous," John says. "You heard us in a terrible room with terrible acoustics. You heard us trying. On the way out." "Fuck that," John says, "and fuck him. We're good, we know we're good. We just had a bad audition, in a bad room, with a bad judge, but that doesn't mean we're bad." George speaks for the first time in hours. "So, what do? We get better," John says simply. "We practice harder. We write better songs. We find someone who will listen. Because Mike Smith doesn't get to decide our future. We do." Something shifts in the van. The despair begins to lift, replaced by something else: determination, defiance, refusal to quit. Liverpool, 1962. The Beatles don't give up. Instead, they do exactly what John said. They get better. They play the Cavern Club almost every night, sometimes twice a day, perfecting their sound, building their following. Brian Epstein doesn't give up either. He sends demo tapes to every record label in England and gets rejected by all of them. EMI, Pi, Philips, Columbia, every single one says the same thing. Guitar groups are on the way out. The Beatles have no future in show business. But Brian keeps trying because he believes. In May 1962, something changes. George Martin, a producer at EMI, agrees to meet the Beatles, not because he thinks they're special, but because he has a gap in his schedule. The audition is at Abbey Road Studios. The Beatles are nervous again, but this time it's different. They're not trying to impress anyone, they're just being themselves. George Martin listens to them play, and unlike Mike Smith, he really listens. "You're rough," George says after they finish. "Your drummer isn't quite right, and too hard to impress someone who'd already decided to reject us. But you didn't hear the Beatles," John continues. "You didn't hear what we can really do." Mike Smith walks to the door, opens it. "This audition is over," he says. "Please collect your equipment and leave." The drive back to Liverpool is silent. Nobody speaks for the first hour. What is there to say? They failed completely, utterly. Their big chance, and they blew it. Brian Epstein keeps apologizing. "I'm sorry, boys. I thought this was it. I thought Decca would see what I see." But the Beatles aren't listening. They're each lost in their own thoughts, their own pain. George is thinking about going back to being an electrician. Pete is wondering if he should have stayed in school. Paul is thinking about his father's disappointment. But John is thinking about something else. "Stop the van," John says suddenly. "What?" Brian asks. "Stop the van, now." Brian pulls over to the side of the road. They're somewhere between London and Liverpool, middle of nowhere. Still snowing. John gets out of the van, walks a few steps away, stands in the snow. The others watch him through the window, wondering what he's doing. Then John screams, a primal, rage-filled scream that echoes across the empty fields. He screams until his voice gives out, until he's hoarse, until he's empty. Then he walks back to the van, gets in, looks at the others. "Right," John says, his voice rough but determined. "Here's what we're going to do. We're going to prove that bastard wrong." Paul looks up. "John, maybe he's right. Maybe guitar groups are. Your songs need work." The Beatles brace for rejection. "But," George continues, "there's something there. Something I can't quite define, but something real." "I'll give you a chance," George says. "One single. If it sells, we'll talk about an album." The Beatles sign with EMI. Pete Best is replaced by Ringo Starr. And in October 1962, "Love Me Do" is released. It reaches number 17 in the UK charts. Not huge, but a start. "Please Please Me" follows in January 1963. It reaches number 1. By the end of 1963, the Beatles are the biggest band in Britain. By 1964, they're conquering America. By 1965, they're the biggest band in the world. And Mike Smith, the man who said they had no future, becomes the answer to a trivia question. Who was the man who rejected the Beatles? London, 1964, 2 years after the Decca audition. The Beatles are at the height of Beatlemania. Mike Smith is still working at Decca, still auditioning bands, still rejecting most of them. But now everyone knows his name, not because of the bands he signed, but because of the band he rejected. One day Mike receives a phone call from Brian Epstein. "Mr. Smith," Brian says, "I'd like to invite you to a Beatles concert as my personal guest." Mike is confused. "Why would you want me there?" "Because," Brian says, "I think you should see what you missed." Mike almost says no, but curiosity gets the better of him. He goes to the concert at the London Palladium, where the Beatles are playing to 2,000 screaming fans. And as Mike watches, as he sees the energy, the talent, the undeniable magic, he realizes something. He didn't just reject a band, he rejected the future of music. After the show, Brian brings Mike backstage. The Beatles are there, exhausted but happy. "Boys," Brian says, "I'd like you to meet someone. This is Mike Smith, from Decca Records." The room goes quiet. Everyone knows who Mike Smith is. John Lennon looks at him, and for a moment Mike thinks John is going to yell, to gloat, to rub his face in his mistake. Instead, John walks over, extends his hand. "Thanks, John." Says, "For what?" Mike asks, confused. "For rejecting us," John says, "because if you'd signed us, we might have ended up on Decca, instead of with George Martin. And George Martin made us better." "So really," John continues, "you did us a favor." Mike Smith doesn't know what to say. "But I want you to know something," John adds. "What you said that day, about guitar groups being on the way out, about us having no future, that almost destroyed us. We drove back to Liverpool thinking we'd failed, thinking maybe you were right. But then I realized something. You don't get to decide our future. We do, and that's the lesson," John says. "Not that you were wrong, but that we refused to let you be right." Today, the story of the Beatles' Decca audition is one of the most famous rejection stories in music history. It's taught in business schools as an example of how experts can be wrong, how conventional wisdom can be blind. It's told to aspiring musicians as proof that rejection doesn't mean failure, that one person's opinion doesn't define your worth. Mike Smith, before he died in 2008, gave several interviews about that day. "I was wrong," he said simply, "completely, utterly wrong. I let my preconceptions blind me. I heard what I expected to hear, instead of what was really there." But Mike added, "I don't think I destroyed the Beatles. I think I motivated them, because sometimes the best thing that can happen to talented people is to be told they're not good enough. It forces them to prove just how good they really are." Martin, who produced. The Beatles said something similar. The Decca rejection was the best thing that could have happened to the Beatles because it made them hungry, made them determined, made them refuse to accept no for an answer. Paul McCartney, in interviews years later, said, "That drive back from London was one of the worst days of my life, but also one of the most important, because that's when we decided that we weren't going to let anyone tell us what we could or couldn't do. That's when we became the Beatles." The Decca audition tapes were eventually released in 1994, and they're not as bad as the legend suggests. "You can hear the nerves," one music critic wrote. "You can hear them trying too hard, but you can also hear the potential, the raw talent that would soon change the world." Today, those tapes are collector's items, not because they're great recordings, but because they represent something important, the moment when the band in history was told they had no future and refused to believe it. The story of the Beatles and Decca reminds us that rejection is not the end, it's just one person's opinion, one moment in time. What matters is what you do next. Do you give up, or do you prove them wrong? The Beatles chose to prove them wrong, and in doing so, they didn't just become successful, they changed music forever. Mike Smith's words, "Guitar groups are on the way out. The Beatles have no future in show business," became the most wrong prediction in music history, but they also became something else. A reminder that the people who tell you that you can't are often the people who motivate you to prove that you can. The Beatles' Decca audition lasted 2 minutes, 2 minutes that were supposed to end their dream. Instead, those 2 minutes became the beginning of the greatest success story in the history of popular music, because sometimes the best response to "that's enough" is "we're just getting started." And that's exactly what the Beatles did. The Beatles did their first audition, which lasted 2 minutes before they said, "That's enough." What happened next? They were rejected, told they had no future, sent home as failures, but instead of giving up, they got angry, they got determined, they got better, and they proved that rejection is just one person's opinion, not a fact, not a destiny, just an opinion. The Beatles turned the worst day of their lives into the motivation that changed music forever, because that's what legends do. They don't let rejection define them, they let it fuel them. And sometimes the 2 minutes that are supposed to end your dream become the 2 minutes that make it unstoppable.